So very briefly, I want to show you how I built this template, and I advise that anyone that hasn't seen my first workshop to go through it, because I go in detail through how I build the template. But very briefly, here you see my channels: flute, oboe, some woodwind staccatos, my strings, my brass, etc. This is a little diagram that shows how the signal flow goes. So the flute sends into the woodwind's reverb, and the woodwind's reverb feeds into the woodwind's group, while the flute, this is the dry channel, also feeds into the woodwind group. So the woodwind group is now the sum of the reverb and the dry signal. Exactly the same goes with the strings, exactly the same goes with the brass, and most of the instruments. As you can see here, I created groups for each of the individual instrument groups. So we have strings, woodwinds, brass, harp, piano, and melodic percussion, timpani, percussion, synths, voice, plucks. And you can add more groups. In my professional template that I use, I have even more groups going through. That I have a group for first violins, second violins, violi, celli, basses, etc. And you might ask why I create these groups. And the idea behind this is that if I have to deliver stems to the client, and they say, oh, we want strings, woodwinds, brass, harp, piano, timpani, all I need to do is just export the groups, and my stems, are basically done. But in short, we can look at what effects I have. I have FabFilter 3 on just to clean out some of the dirt in the strings and the brass. And then I use Valhalla Room and Valhalla Vintage Verb for the reverbs on the inserts. And on my reverb sends that I have for the woodwinds, brass, harp, and strings, I'm using East-West Spaces 2. Specifically, I'm using the SoCal Orchestra Hall, and I'm using the specific instrument groups for each of the reverbs. So I don't want to go into too much detail here. Please, if you haven't watched the first workshop, highly recommend it if you want to, build your own template from scratch. Why do you need different reverbs for each section the orchestra plays in one room? You don't really need different reverbs for different, ensembles, but what East-West has done, and why I like their reverb for the orchestral instruments, because if this is the hall, and let's say we have, the violins here, so let me divide it here. So the strings are kind of here, then are the woodwinds. I'm just gonna do strings, woodwinds, brass. So this is the kind of the positioning in a hall. You would first have the woodwinds in front. You would have the strings in front, the woodwinds a little more back, and the brass would be way back. And behind the brass is usually the percussion. So what East-West has done when they sampled the impulse response for the individual sections in the orchestra, they sampled the strings impulse response where the strings are. They sampled the woodwinds impulse response where the woodwinds are. They sampled the brass where the brass is and the percussion where the percussion is. So you get a different impulse response based on the position of the ensemble in the call. So what you get is a much better representation of the actual reverb of the instruments in that exact position. So that's why I used East-West for the reverb. I just think it sounds really good. The alternative is, of course, Altiverb, but it's much more expensive.